ready to dive deep. Today we're taking a shortcut through some pretty dense philosophical territory. We're talking about naturalism, but with a twist.
Yeah, we're going beyond the usual Western philosophy stuff. We're looking at how classical Indian thinkers viewed the natural world.
And trust me, it's way more relevant than you might think, especially if you're a philosophy buff already familiar with ideas like ontological naturalism.
Right, the idea that everything that exists is part of the natural world, no supernatural beings needed.
Exactly, or methodological naturalism.
Which basically says, hey, philosophy, stick to the methods of science if you want to get to the truth.
And of course, moral naturalism.
That's the idea that moral facts are just as much a part of the natural order as, say, the laws of physics.
And while these ancient Indian philosophers didn't use those exact terms, their ideas about nature and our place in it really get at those same core concepts.
Our main guide for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's got a really comprehensive entry on naturalism in classical Indian thought.
So by the end of this, any philosopher listening in will have a much better grasp of how another philosophical tradition tackled these big questions that are still so central to debate today. Okay, first things first, let's set the stage. What's the historical and philosophical context here?
Well, when we talk about classical Indian philosophy, we're talking about a huge chunk of time, roughly from the end of the Vedic era, so around the 6th century BCE, all the way to the 15th century CE.
A long period with a ton of different schools of thought, right?
Absolutely. And there's a major division. Some schools accepted the authority of the Vedas, like Vedanta, Masa, Sakya, Yoga, Nyaya, and Vaishika. Those are the orthodox schools.
And then you have the heterodox schools.
Like the Carvaka materialists, Buddhism, and Jainism. They challenge the authority of the Vedas.
And here's what I find so interesting. We see naturalistic ideas popping up in both groups.
Exactly. Even those who accepted the Vedas, which have a lot of religious elements, were wrestling with ideas about the natural world in ways that resonate with modern naturalism. To understand this better, we can use Peter Strawson's distinction
Between hard and soft naturalism.
Right. Hard naturalism is all about reducing everything to physical laws. Humans are just objects governed by cause and effect.
And soft naturalism.
It's a bit more open. It allows for things like subjective experience, intentionality, our ability to reason and make choices. It recognizes that there's more to being human than what science can measure.
So it gives us a bit more wiggle room,
Yeah.
right, to account for those aspects of reality that aren't easily explained by purely physical processes.
Exactly. Now, Janardhan Ganeri, building on John McDowell, applied this distinction to Indian philosophy. He linked hard naturalism to what he calls the realm of law, the domain of science and physical causality.
And soft naturalism to the space of reasons.
Which encompasses our subjective experiences, our inner lives, the realm of values and meaning. The key takeaway is that soft naturalism allows us to make sense of things that go beyond strict scientific explanation without necessarily invoking the supernatural.
Which is crucial when we're trying to map these ancient ideas onto modern debates, because it's not just a simple either or. It's not naturalist versus non-naturalist.
Right. It's more complex than that. And we also need to be mindful of the distinction between methodological and substantive naturalism. Methodological naturalism focuses on how we approach inquiry. It's about the relationship between philosophy and science.
So should philosophy just become a branch of science, or can it still have its own distinct role?
Exactly. That's the kind of question methodological naturalism grapples with. It's a spectrum, really. You have replacement naturalism, where science takes over and philosophy becomes obsolete. Then you have expansionist naturalism, where philosophy and science work together, but philosophy keeps a normative role. It can still talk about values and meaning. Then there's substantive naturalism.
Which is all about what actually exists, the stuff of reality.
Right. Ontological naturalism is the most common type. That's the view that only natural entities exist, no gods or spirits. And then there's semantic naturalism, which deals with the meaning of philosophical concepts. Can they ultimately be explained in empirical terms?
Okay, that's a helpful framework to have in mind as we dive in. So when these Indian schools thought about nature, what did they have in mind? What were their core conceptions?
The common thread was that nature often referred to the world we experience, the world of our senses.
Makes sense. The world we can see, touch, hear, smell, taste.
But of course, in philosophy, there are always exceptions.
Right. Let's start with the extremes, those who really push the boundaries of what we might consider naturalistic.
Okay, on one end, we have Advaita Vedanta. This school, a naturalist philosopher, might find them a bit hard to swallow.
Why is that?
Well, they claimed that this world, everything we perceive, is ultimately an illusion. It's just a temporary appearance of the one true reality, which is Brahman, a pure, undifferentiated consciousness. So ontologically speaking, they're pretty far from naturalism.
So for Advaita Vedanta, the natural world as we know it is basically a grand cosmic mirage. On the other end of the spectrum, who did we have?
The Carvaka materialists. They were all about this world. They believed that this physical world is the only reality and everything is made up of matter.
No room for anything beyond the physical.
Nope. Even consciousness, for them, was just an emergent property of certain arrangements of matter. The self was nothing more than the physical body.
Pure, hardcore materialism. A fascinating early example of that viewpoint.
Absolutely. And they were also known as Svabhavavadins. It means those who believe in inherent nature.
Inherent nature.
They believe that things have an intrinsic nature, a svabhava, that determines how they behave. Effects arise from this inherent nature, not necessarily from external causes.
Wait, a form of naturalism that downplays causation? That's pretty radical, especially from a Western perspective.
Right. It's a big departure from how we typically think about naturalism, which is all about explaining things through cause and effect. But the Carvakas thought the key to understanding the world was to understand the inherent nature of things. They presented a unique and arguably hard form of naturalism.
So they were naturalists, but in a very different way than what we're used to. Okay, between those two extremes, we have the atomists and the proponents of a primordial nature. Let's tackle the atomists first.
The main players here were Nyaya Vaishika and certain schools within Buddhism and Jainism. They all believed that the world is made up of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms.
So kind of like Democritus and the ancient Greeks.
Some similarities, but also some important differences. Take Nyaya Vaishika, for example. They presented a pretty clever argument for atoms.
Okay, lay it on me.
They started by observing that everything we see has parts, right?
Sure.
So even the smallest thing you can see must be divisible. But they argued that this division can't go on forever. Otherwise, a mountain and a mustard seed would have the same number of parts.
And that's absurd.
Totally. So they concluded that there must be some ultimate indivisible units. That's where atoms come in.
Classic philosophical move. To avoid absurdity, you posit a fundamental level of reality. So what were these atoms like?
Well, each type of atom corresponded to one of the four elements.
Earth, water, fire, air.
Exactly. And each type had a unique quality. Odor for earth atoms, taste for water, color for fire, and touch for air.
So they were qualitatively different.
Right. But they were all the same size.
Yeah.
And they had this specific way of combining. 2 atoms would form a dyad, and 3 dyads would form a triad.
And that triad was the smallest perceptible unit.
That's what they argued. They had to come up with explanations for why different types of atoms couldn't combine directly, and why we don't perceive dyads.
The kinds of questions a good philosopher would ask.
Exactly. And they had their answers. They argued that atoms of different types couldn't combine because the resulting substance wouldn't fit into any of the 4 elemental categories. And they said that perceptibility depends on the number of parts, not just the size. So a triad, with its 6 atoms, would be the first perceptible entity.
Okay, so they built a whole system around these atoms. What about the mind? Where did consciousness fit in?
They considered the mind, or manas, to be a substance.
But an atomic one.
Yep, an atomic and corporeal substance, but without any of the sensible qualities. So it couldn't be perceived, but it could interact with the material atoms.
Okay, so they have both material and mental atoms. How do they explain causation within this framework?
They called their theory of causation Arampavada. Basically, it means that an effect is something totally new that comes into being. It's not just a modification of pre-existing stuff. And they recognize different types of causes. Inherent causes, which were the atoms themselves. Non-inherent causes, like the specific arrangement of atoms. And efficient causes.
And this is where things get interesting, right?
Because among their efficient causes were God and Adua.
Mm-hmm.
It's often translated as the unseen, and it refers to the accumulated merits and demerits from our past actions. So you have this blend of natural elements like atoms and something that sounds a bit more, well, supernatural.
A philosopher attuned to naturalism might find that a bit puzzling. How do they reconcile this with a naturalistic worldview?
It's a good question. I think it highlights how differently they conceived of the natural. They were comfortable attributing causal efficacy to things like numbers, for example, to explain the size of objects. So it wasn't just about physical matter. There was this broader cosmic order at play, and God and Adua operated within that order.
Okay, so their naturalism was more expansive than what we might typically think of. What about the other atomists, the Buddhists and Jains? How did their views compare?
Some pretty significant differences. Buddhist atomism, especially the Vibhaka and Sautrantika schools, they said atoms are momentary. They exist for just a tiny, fleeting moment. Some Sautrantikas even thought of atoms as points of energy rather than solid particles.
Fleeting atoms. Interesting. What about a Jainist?
They had their own take on it. They believed in atoms, but they thought all atoms were qualitatively the same. Each atom had a bit of every taste, smell, color, and touch. The differences in qualities we perceive in the world arise from the different ways atoms combine.
Okay, so a different kind of atomism. And how did they explain the combination of atoms? That was a tricky point for Vaishika, wasn't it?
It was. They often had to appeal to God or Advaita to explain why atoms combine the way they do. The Buddhists and Jainas, they tried to come up with more naturalistic explanations.
In what way?
The Jainas, for example, they observed that certain things just naturally stick together, like honey and water.
Makes sense.
So they said that atoms have these inherent properties that determine how they bond. They even had rules for combination based on these properties.
So more of a mechanistic explanation.
Exactly. And some later Vaipayika Buddhists, like Supagupta, they came up with the idea of Dravya-shakti.
Dravya-shakti.
It means inherent potency. He thought that atoms have this inner power or force that draws them together in specific ways, kind of like a mantra attracting a snake.
So they were all trying to figure out how to explain the world in terms of its basic building blocks, but without having to resort to outside intervention.
Right. Their focus was on the inherent properties and forces within nature itself.
Okay, so that's the atomist camp.
Yeah.
But you mentioned there was another view of nature, one that didn't involve atoms.
That's the Sakya school.
Yeah.
They went in a completely different direction. Instead of atoms, they believed that the world evolves from a single, undifferentiated source called prakriti. It's often translated as primordial nature or nature. It's not made up of parts. It's a unified whole. And it's characterized by three fundamental qualities, or gutas.
Which are?
Sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva is associated with illumination, goodness, purity. Rajas is about activity, passion, energy. And tamas is inertia, darkness, heaviness.
A cosmic triad.
Exactly. These gutas are constantly interacting and transforming, giving rise to the diversity of the world.
So how does this evolution from Prakriti work?
It's a gradual unfolding. First comes Mahatattva, the cosmic intellect. From that emerges Ahakara, the principle of individuation, the sense of I.
So this is where the separateness of individual beings comes from.
Right. And from Ahakara, you get the sense organs, the motor organs, the mind, the subtle elements, and finally the gross elements that make up the physical world.
Like a cosmic tree branching out from a single seed. What about causation? How do they explain that?
They had a theory called Satkaryavada. It means that the effect already exists in the cause in a potential form.
So nothing truly new is created. It's just a transformation of what's already there.
Right. They use the analogy of oil in sesame seeds. The oil isn't created when you press the seeds, it's just made manifest. They argue that this is how the whole universe evolves from Prakriti. It's a real transformation, not an illusion, as some other schools claimed.
Okay, so no creation ex nihilo. Everything has its roots in this primordial Prakriti, but they also have the concept of Purua, right?
Right, Puru, the conscious self, the spirit.
How does that fit in?
This is where things get tricky for a purely naturalistic interpretation. They saw Puru as distinct from Prakriti. It's passive, unchanging, and eternal, while Prakriti is active and constantly evolving. And they said that the whole purpose of Prakriti's evolution is for the sake of Pua.
So this unconscious, ever-changing nature is somehow acting for the benefit of this conscious, unchanging self. That's a bit hard to wrap your head around.
It is. They had this idea of a proto-naturalistic teleology. Prakriti is acting with a purpose, even though it's not conscious. They used analogies like a cow producing milk for its calf or rain falling to sustain life.
So nature is acting in a purposeful way, even without a conscious director. A philosopher would have a lot to say about that.
Absolutely. The relationship between Puru and Prati and how they interact is a central question in Sakya philosophy. Some early Sakya thinkers actually proposed that the self is just an unmanifest part of Pratiti. But the classical Sakya that became most influential, they went with a dualistic view.
Two separate and distinct principles.
Right. And some scholars think this shift towards dualism was motivated by the need to explain things like morality and liberation.
Things that are hard to account for if you only have a purely material world.
Exactly. So while Sakya gives us this comprehensive account of nature evolving from Prati, they also introduce this other principle, Purva, which complicates the picture from a naturalist perspective. It raises questions about the nature of consciousness, teleology, and the relationship between the mental and the physical. Okay, speaking of consciousness, let's shift gears and talk about how these different schools tackled the problem of the self and consciousness.
Always a thorny issue in philosophy.
For the most part, they lean towards soft naturalism when it came to mind and consciousness.
So, open to subjective experience and mental states without necessarily reducing them to purely physical processes.
Right. The exceptions, of course, are the hard naturalist Carvakas and the non-naturalist Advaita Vedantins. But what's interesting is that they all started their investigations from the standpoint of lived experience.
From our own direct awareness of our thoughts, feelings, perceptions.
Exactly. They took that as their starting point. Now, schools like Nyavaisheka, Jainism, and Prabhakar Mimamsa, they had this pluralistic worldview. They believed in multiple categories of reality.
So not just material substances.
Right. They had room for things like the self, the mind, consciousness, emotions, and so on as distinct entities. This allowed them to avoid some of the problems that Western philosophy has struggled with, like the mind-body problem.
The classic conundrum of how two seemingly different things, mind and matter, can interact.
Exactly. And it also sidesteps the issue of reductionism. Because they weren't trying to reduce everything to a single fundamental principle, they could accommodate both the mental and the physical within their understanding of nature.
So a more inclusive view of what natural can encompass.
Exactly. Now, the Vedantins, they had a whole range of views on consciousness. As we discussed, Sukara's Advaita Vedanta is clearly non-naturalistic. They think the world is an illusion and the true self is identical with Brahman. But other Vedanta schools, like Ramanuja and Madhva, they saw the world as a real emanation or transformation of Brahman.
So a kind of qualified naturalism?
You could see it that way. They were trying to explain the whole of reality in terms of a single ultimate principle, even though it wasn't just material substance. And then you have the Karvakas, the hardcore materialists.
How do they deal with consciousness?
They were emergentists. They believed that consciousness arises from specific combinations of matter, even though matter itself isn't conscious.
So consciousness is a byproduct of complex material organization.
Exactly. They used analogies like the red color that emerges when you mix certain ingredients or the intoxicating effect of fermented grains. They famously used the analogy of water being formed from hydrogen and oxygen.
So consciousness is something new that emerges when the right ingredients come together in the right way.
That's their view. While many have interpreted this as straight-up reductionism, Janardhan Guneri has suggested that it could also be seen as a form of non-reductive supervenience.
Meaning?
Consciousness depends on the material base, but it's not reducible to just the sum of its parts. It's something more than that.
So different ways of trying to naturalize consciousness. What about Nyavaishika? How did they approach it?
They thought consciousness was an adventitious quality of the self. It's not an essential part of who we are.
Meaning?
It means we're not always conscious. It arises only when the self is embodied. They had this whole system where they categorized different entities, the self, the body, the senses, the objects of experience, the intellect, the mind, and so on.
A pretty elaborate metaphysical framework.
It is. And they explain consciousness in terms of the interaction between these entities. The self is the knower, but it needs the body and mind to have experiences. They also believed in liberation, a state where the self is freed from embodiment and therefore from consciousness.
So consciousness is a temporary state for them.
Right. It's tied to our embodied existence. And their emphasis on the self-body continuum and the possibility of liberation suggests a form of liberal naturalism. They acknowledge both the material and the mental without trying to reduce one to the other.
Okay, what about the Buddhists? They're famous for the idea of no self and Atman.
Right. They don't believe in a permanent, unchanging self, but they still had to account for consciousness. In early Buddhism, consciousness, or vinya, is part of this 12-link chain of dependent origination.
Dependent origination.
It's this central Buddhist doctrine that explains how everything arises in dependence on other things. There's no ultimate beginning or end, just this constant flow of causes and conditions. And consciousness is a link in this chain. It arises from ignorance and mental formations and then conditions the psychophysical makeup of an individual.
So consciousness is a product of previous causes.
Right. And it's also impermanent. They analyzed what we usually think of as the I or the self as a collection of 5 aggregates.
Which are?
Matter, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates work together, but they're constantly changing. There's no fixed, enduring self behind them.
And they have different types of consciousness.
Yes, 6 types corresponding to the 5 senses and the mind. Each type arises in dependence on its object. So, for example, eye consciousness arises in dependence on a visual form. This perspective aligns with a liberal form of naturalism. It explains consciousness in terms of causal processes within the realm of experience without positing a permanent soul or a supernatural realm.
It's amazing how these different schools, even with their wildly different metaphysics, were all wrestling with the same fundamental philosophical questions about consciousness and trying to find naturalistic explanations. It just shows how central these issues are to philosophy, regardless of your background or tradition.
Absolutely. It speaks to the universality of these questions and the human drive to understand ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how these schools approached the very methods of philosophical inquiry. Did any of them exhibit what we might call methodological naturalism?
Oh, definitely. Methodological naturalism, the idea that philosophy and science are on the same page when it comes to their goals and methods, that resonates strongly with classical Indian thought. They might not have had the same disciplinary boundaries as we do today, but we can definitely see how they valued rigorous inquiry and continuity between empirical observation, logical reasoning, and philosophical reflection.
Any particular school that stands out in this regard?
The Nyaya school is a prime example. They made major contributions to epistemology and really emphasized a systematic and logical approach to knowledge.
For a philosopher who loves epistemology, the study of knowledge, what was so special about the Nyaya method?
Well, they had this structured 4-step process for inquiry. First, you enumerate the topics you're going to investigate. That's uddesha. Then you define those topics precisely. That's lakunas. Next comes parikam, where you critically examine and test your definitions. And finally, you arrive at a well-established and verified theory, or siddhanta.
This is like a very thorough and methodical approach.
It is. They really emphasized clarity of definition and rigorous testing through both logic and experience. They saw a close connection between common sense, empirical observation, logical inference, and even scriptural testimony, as long as it came from a reliable source.
So a more integrated view of knowledge than the strict divisions we sometimes see in Western philosophy.
Right. Western analytic epistemology often gets very focused on justification, on proving that our beliefs are true, and it tends to separate causal explanations of how we form beliefs from the justification of those beliefs.
You mean like how my belief that there's a coffee cup in front of me is caused by light hitting my eyes and signals going to my brain versus whether I'm justified in believing that the coffee cup is real and not an illusion?
Exactly. Now, naturalized epistemology comes along and challenges this separation. It says, hey, we need to consider the causal story too. How we actually come to have beliefs matters.
So it's not just about armchair reasoning. It's about how our minds work in the real world.
Right. Some radical naturalists even think that epistemology should be replaced by psychology. Just study how the brain works and that's all you need. But more moderate naturalists say, no, there's still a role for philosophy. We just need to ground justification in reliable causal processes.
So how does Nyaya fit into all of this?
Well, I'd say they were definitely leaning towards a moderate form of methodological naturalism. They took skepticism seriously and tried to provide a naturalized account of how we come to have knowledge. They emphasized perception as a primary source of knowledge and saw a clear continuity between how we investigate the world through our senses and how we reason about philosophical questions.
So no sharp divide between empirical science and philosophical inquiry for them.
Right. And they didn't get hung up on those strict a priori, a posteriori, or analytic synthetic distinctions that have been so influential in Western philosophy. They were happy to move between descriptive accounts of how we know things and normative claims about what constitutes genuine knowledge.
Okay, so they were naturalists in their approach to inquiry. How did they actually deal with skepticism?
They had a multi-pronged strategy. First, they identified 4 reliable sources of true belief: perception, inference, comparison, and verbal testimony. These are the pramas. And they argued that when these pramas are functioning properly, they give us true beliefs.
So they were laying out the conditions for reliable knowledge.
Exactly. But they also recognize that you can have false beliefs even when a pramada is functioning properly.
Because of defects or errors in the process?
Right. They called these duas. Like, if you're seeing things in dim light, you might misperceive something. Or if you're reasoning from a false premise, your conclusion will be wrong. They were very attentive to these potential sources of error.
It sounds like they were really trying to account for how our cognitive processes can go wrong. But what about cases where we get lucky? Like, we believe something for the wrong reasons, but it turns out to be true anyway.
That's the problem of epistemic luck, and they were definitely aware of it. They gave examples like someone mistaking smoke for mist but still correctly inferring that there's a fire on a distant hill, or a liar who happens to tell the truth by accident. They said that while defects are necessary for error, they're not sufficient. You can have a defect and still end up with a true belief just by chance.
So being right isn't enough. The process has to be reliable too.
Exactly. They were concerned with how we arrive at beliefs, not just whether they happen to be true. Now, this raises the question of how they justified their premises in the first place. How did they know that these sources of knowledge were actually reliable?
It sounds like a potential circularity. You need a pramat to justify another pramat.
It's a good question. They had this interesting pragmatic theory of ratification. They called it samvadi prabhuti, which basically means coherent volition leading to successful action.
So it's not just about having a belief, it's about what you do with that belief.
Right. If your belief leads to successful action, that's a good sign that it's true. They use the example of a thirsty traveler who sees water in the distance. Even if the traveler has doubts, if they go to that water and it quenches their thirst, that confirms the truth of their initial perception.
It's about the coherence between your beliefs and your actions.
Exactly. And they applied this to scientific knowledge, too. They thought that the success of medical practices, for example, was a good indication that the underlying theories were true. They even used this approach to justify the acceptance of scriptural pronouncements.
So if a religious text says to do something, and that leads to positive outcomes, that's a sign that the text is reliable.
That was their argument. They drew an analogy to trusting a doctor's prescription. We don't necessarily understand all the medical reasoning behind it, but if it works, we accept it.
A pragmatic approach.
Very much so. And they were comfortable with a certain degree of circularity in their justification. They preferred the analogy of repairing a boat while still floating in it. You don't need to have a perfectly secure foundation for everything before you can start making progress.
It's like a good metaphor for philosophy in general.
It is. Now, of course, not everyone was convinced by the Nyaya approach. Buddhist philosophers, especially the Madhyamikas, they were master skeptics.
Like Nagarjuna.
Right. He argued that any attempt to justify a prama leads to either an infinite regress or a vicious circle.
So you either need an infinite chain of pramadas to support each other, or you end up using a pramada to justify itself.
Exactly. The Nayikas responded by saying, hey, we have 4 different pramadas. We can use one to support another.
So perception might be supported by inference, and inference by verbal testimony, and so on.
Right. It's like a web of interconnected beliefs where different parts can support each other. Similar to Quine's idea of a web of belief in Western philosophy.
No need for an absolute foundation.
Exactly. So the Nayikas were pretty sophisticated in their approach to epistemology, and they had a strong commitment to a naturalistic methodology. Okay, on to our last big topic, moral naturalism. How did classical Indian philosophy understand the connection between morality and the natural world?
This is where karma comes in, right?
Karma is central. Moral naturalism, as we've defined it, has 2 parts. First, moral facts are natural facts. Second, moral facts have causal power in the world.
So our actions have real consequences, not just in some abstract moral realm, but in the natural world.
Right, and karma embodies both of these ideas. The doctrine of karma says that every action creates consequences. Good actions lead to good results. Bad actions lead to bad results. It's about individual responsibility. You reap what you sow.
Makes sense. But there's a problem, right? It doesn't always seem like good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
That's the classic challenge to karma. How do you explain the apparent injustice in the world? And this is where rebirth comes in.
Sora, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth.
Exactly. It's not just about this life. The consequences of our actions can extend over multiple lifetimes. So the suffering you experience now might be the result of actions you did in a past life, and the good fortune you enjoy might be due to past good deeds.
So it's a cosmic balancing act.
You could see it that way. Now, obviously, rebirth is not something that can be empirically verified in the usual scientific sense.
Though some people claim to have memories of past lives.
Right. But even without that, the idea of rebirth provides a logical framework for understanding how karma can operate consistently, even if we don't see the immediate results in this life.
So it makes sense within their worldview. And this cosmic order, this overarching principle that governs both the physical and the moral realms, they call it Inta, right?
It's this idea of a cosmic order, a lawfulness that pervades all of reality. And karma is a key part of Ikta. Even the gods are subject to karma.
So it's not just some human invention, it's built into the fabric of the universe.
Exactly. And karma is typically divided into three types. Prarabdha karma, which is the karma that's currently playing out in your life. Sanyayamana karma, which is the karma you're accumulating now through your actions. And Sanyashita karma, which is all the karma you've accumulated in the past that hasn't ripened yet.
It's like a cosmic bank account.
Kind of. The key takeaway is that karma provides a causal explanation for moral phenomena. It connects our actions to their consequences in a very concrete way.
So morality isn't just some abstract set of rules, it's woven into the very fabric of reality. Were there any schools that disagreed with this?
There were nuances and variations. The Mimamsaka school, for example, while accepting karma in general, they had a slightly different view when it came to rituals.
Rituals.
Like the Vedic sacrifices. They thought that rituals had a special kind of efficacy that couldn't be explained by ordinary natural causes.
So there was a realm of ritual action that operated outside the normal laws of nature.
That was their view. But other schools, like Nyaya, tried to integrate karma more fully into their naturalism.